Canada's identity is largely a battle between two systems. These lessons in history have a lot of universal value. There's definitely something you can extract from that in order to enrich our ability to appreciate and analyze and discern. The common perennial theme of all of these is that human beings are just another type of animal to be controlled by higher alphas who must control the perceptions of those lower slave castes in some rigid structure of master-slave relation. George Brown and John Macdonald are two founding fathers, but who were also sold to us as oppositional enemies. Not true. They were actually playing two sides of the same game. The thing that infuses value into whatever we agree upon as currency has got to be tied to the physical reality of the thing we live in, which the Federal Reserve was designed to cut us off of.
Well, hello friends, Dr. Mark Trozzi here. I'm bringing you something very special, a little outside of my normal wheelhouse. So this is not going to be about messenger RNA or even self-assembling nanotechnology or how to detox. We are going to talk about history. And as I came towards this interview, which actually I've been very excited about doing this for a while, having Matthew Ehret, who I'm going to tell you a little more about on this show. I think of a couple of great quotes, and one comes from Jesus Christ when he said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And certainly that's true with regards to injections and biology, but it's very true in terms of history. And the truth is maybe a hard thing to find in history because, as we know, as my grandmother told me, his story is his story because it was written by the winner or whoever walked out on top of the situation, which isn't always the good guys and the honest guys. So today's going to be pretty enlightening. And I also think of another great teacher of modern times, Bob Marley, who said, "If you know your history, then you will know where you're coming from." And I think if we know where we're coming from, we're going to understand where we are, and it's going to give us a better idea of how to navigate to where we really want to be, which is certainly not where the globalists have been trying to take the world. So let me tell you a little bit about Matthew Erat. He stands as one of the most insightful and courageous historians and writers of our time. He is the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot Review. He is a senior fellow of the American University in Moscow and director of the Rising Tide Foundation. He is a prolific author whose work includes the 4-volume Untold History of Canada series, the 4-volume Clash of the Two Americas series, the Revenge of the Mystery Cult trilogy, and Science Unshackled, Restoring Causality to a World in Chaos. He's also the co-host of the weekly Breaking History on Badlands Media and the host of Pluralia Dialogos. And so Matthew's visionary analysis are inspiring of a renaissance of sovereign thinking and multipolar cooperation. I would put forward that his brilliant scholarship enlightens and empowers all who seek genuine historical understanding. I certainly do. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. I first got to hear you speak at a Freedom Leaders meeting about the history of Canada. I know we're going to dive into that, and I've been following you since then. And your knowledge of history is very detailed in Canada from the beginning of what may be considered Canada. But also, I've come to learn that your understanding is very detailed about pretty much the entire history of the world. So I'm very excited to have you with us, Matthew.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you for that really generous introduction. I hope I can live up to at least a fraction of that opening description. And I gotta just say, it's an honor as well to just join you in our first face-to-face chat. I've followed your work since the opening dark days of COVID, and I've highly appreciated your consistent analysis. So it's a joy for me to just be here and chat with you.
Well, thank you, Matthew. I'm honored.
I think that what I'll try to do today with you, and we were chatting a little bit before the recording began pertaining to what would be the best way of approaching this. And I think philosophically speaking, since there is a medical theme, I mean, you've been helping elucidate the nature of disease, of false cures, of ultimately health, and to be a proper diagnosticator of disease, you have to know something about the nature of what health is first. Principally, one just can't be a master of the science of disease. And I think for history as well, philosophically, I think that helps a lot too. And those historians that I've admired and have tried to live up to or be guided by throughout history, that historians, we all live in history. We're all people who, and I don't even like the word historian, right? It narrows it down. It's like we're citizens trying to make sense of the world that we were born into. We're trying to use our free will, our agency, our morality, our conscience, and our reason as best as we can as tools, as instruments to make ourselves better capable of participating in the lawful progress of the species that we're a part of. So we're trying to figure out how this whole thing works. That also means we bump into lies, false narratives that are kind of everywhere as a minefield. And it's not new. It's not just our civilization at this moment in history. It's kind of like been like that all the way back as far as written records go. There's been this problem where humans have been inclined to not use their full potentials and fall victim to those who would like to make shadows appear as though they're reality. Like there's always been this parasitical oligarchical class that saw themselves somehow as the superior breed of masters ordained to lord over the slave class families. And to do that requires certain sophisticated arts of making people less than they should be, right? Less than they were meant to be by normalizing stupidity, normalizing the bestial aspects of the human disposition. And we all have like a little bit of beast and angel within all of us, right? Like as far as, there's that Native American adage, this young person was asking an elder about how to become mature, how to become an adult, and he was taught that or told that, we all have these two wolves inside of us battling, a better part of us and a worse part of us. These and he's like, which one's going to win the fight? And the elder says, whichever one you feed. And the oligarchy has created a lot of techniques of incentivizing feeding the worst part of ourselves so that we think that we are not able to actually self-organize. We're not able to self-govern or be sovereign, and that we ultimately do require some form of elites to lord over us, to give us the freedoms that we might enjoy or take for granted, instead of taking responsibility for defending and improving upon those freedoms as sovereign agencies. So the oligarchy that's been hanging on has been trying to normalize the idea that disease is normal, that that's the normal standard for human beings. And to do that requires getting people to make bad decisions that at different moments of opportunity, which result in condemning future generations. And I think that perspective helped me understand why Canada is what it is. Why are we this monarchy? In of all the American nations of South, Central, North America, we are the only monarchy. That's a paradox for a lot of people, but understand, why is that the case? Why do we have this embedded deep state structure that's been there since 1867, and really since even the earliest days of the United Empire loyalists that didn't want to go with the American revolutionaries and chose to instead create this new pseudo country in in the wake of the US or during the US War of Independence? There were always these strange moments of inflection where we made the wrong decision and then created institutions that protected and enshrined false systems of organization that kept us enmeshed within this otherwise completely artificial system that at least the Americans, for all of their problems, did have the moral fortitude to reject at moments of crisis. Not to say that they can't completely fall on their face and be reabsorbed back into this ancient system of evil. However, there is lessons that we as Canadians could learn if we chose to take on that perspective. So I think that this idea of health and disease assist us quite a bit in navigating the realm of cutting through what are the false narratives of history, where is a more truthful story to be found, and then how do we extract these lessons to our present moment in history, since we will have people living after we are gone, looking back and trying to figure out, well, what was 2026 all about? What was this moment all about? Did people make the right decisions, or were they tragic? And hopefully they in the future can find some inspired lessons of our period where people rose to the occasion and learned from the past. And the last thing I'll say here before I'll throw it back at you is that an old mentor of mine made the point that history doesn't repeat. Though people think history repeats, it actually doesn't repeat. It's fools that repeat history, which I think puts the onus more subjectively on all of us to realize that, bad things keep happening because we don't learn lessons that are available for us to learn, and that's on us. So it's the fault is not entirely in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings.
Well, I think our audience will be very harmonious with that because we're the sort of people that do want to take matters in our own hands, do want to take proactive steps to determine our destiny. In your introduction there, you trigger just there's a crossroads point that I think we don't think about a lot, but it's when you look, it's so profoundly there. I mean, the United Empire loyalists, the American War of Independence. So yeah, when you stop and you go, wait a minute, Because often we think, well, Canadians, Americans, kind of the same. We used to think that. Nowadays, I think that the herd is being steered into some really weird stuff, and the level of propaganda in Canada is such that, a lot of people just get infuriated with anybody who has funny colored hair without analyzing things at all. But if I'm kind of understanding you correctly, and I guess takes us to a very key point in our history, which is very early in the history of Canada, which is a large number of British settlers on this continent said, enough's enough. We don't want to be slaves to the Queen. We don't want private centralized bank. We are going to be free people, and literally fought a war that there was no guarantees of winning that. And a lot of people died to achieve that independence and to give birth to, the US Constitution, and a very solid attempt at what most of us can consider a more free and fair society. But at that same time, what you're reminding us is there were some people who said, no, we want to stay connected and under the Queen. And to this day, a lot of us have been shocked in the last 5 years. COVID woke a lot of people up to start looking at everything to find out, oh, wait, the Prime Minister of the Corporation of Canada gets on his knees and takes an oath to the Queen, not to the Canadian people, not to the Canadian Constitution or the Bill of Rights. So there's been a lot of shocking stuff. And, I think of Bruce Party, who we've had the chance to talk with as well. He said, people think that the system isn't working, but this is how the system was built to work. It's just finally in evil enough hands to use it so horrifically against the people.
Yeah.
So I'd like to throw it back to you, which is okay. So, like, where does this all begin? Like, what is Canada? I mean,
Yeah. That's a great basics open question. Yeah, and I like Bruce's analysis that's exactly correct. It's people say, "Oh, it's so dysfunctional. Things aren't working. It's so broken." It's like, well, no, it was designed to get these effects. It's actually working exactly as it was designed to work. You just didn't notice it because I don't know if it would necessarily be because it wasn't in as evil enough hands so much as the the crisis wasn't ripe enough to feel the scarcity that was built into. So that this system is designed for creating scarcity. And when it's like bending a stick, if you want to think about like analogs of physical reality, you could bend a stick for a while. It's easy to bend it, and it gets harder and harder as that tension builds up, and then you get that breaking point, right? I think that part of Canada, we have this sort of schizoid character. There's something really good about Canada. The fact that we're a first world country, we have a relatively long, compared to other parts of the world, relatively long average life expectancy, although that since COVID, that took a hit. But you could still say, okay, compared to much of the global south, Canada's still got what 78.9 years of age or so on average life expectancy. There's things that, electricity is relatively abundant. Water, fresh water. Again, you always ask what's being put in the water, but the point is there's still water. There's hydropower. I live in Quebec, a lot of hydropower. We go to grocery stores, there's supply chains. So we have these things that provide comfort that are the result of something good. Can't say that I'd rather live without electricity in my world. So one of the early questions I had is how did these good things happen? And I was actually on a plane in 2011 to British Columbia, and I was expected to give a lecture to an audience of political activists. And I realized I had never really been to British Columbia since I was a small child, and I'd never done it for political purposes. So I was on the plane and I was really racking my brain trying to think like, what can I say to the people of British Columbia that I'm going to be speaking to that will be useful, that will empower them. I started doing by this time a little bit of work for a couple of years on trying to piece together this enigma of what is Canada. I'd been a political activist since 2007, but it was mostly for a US orientation. So I'd done work, in Washington. I did political organizing on some campuses, both in Canada, but also in the US around, come to think of it, one of the first campaigns I was on for like a year in 2006 and 7 was stopping the bombing of Iran, stopping Dick Cheney from bombing Iran. And I remember we were lobbying congressional representatives in the U.S. We did some outreach to Ottawa as well to try to get some voices to speak up. And here we are, what, 16, 17 years late, 18 years later, and the bombs are dropping. But all that to say, just a little, yeah. I began during that time to really get bothered by the fact that I didn't know what I was operating in. So around 2007, 2008, I was getting annoyed that I was only talking to Canadians about the US, about the problems of the deep state in the US. We didn't call it deep state, it's shadow government, whatever this thing was, the Wall Street cabal. But I couldn't say like, well, how does this manifest itself in Canada? Are we fine? Are we good? Like, or is it just the US? So a project was launched with a few other like-minded people that I was working with to try to say, well, okay, let's see how this thing that has been quite well mapped out in its growth and evolution in the case of the US banks, the skull and bones secret societies that have taken control of US institutions, that have overseen the murder of many of America's best presidents. Let's take some of that analysis, which ties into the British Empire structures of the city of London, which still to this very day exert global power and influence, not unlike that which we had seen exert by the British city of London in the 19th century and earlier. Very similar thing, except it's maybe been rebranded a little bit, but it's the same thing. So let's take some of that and apply it now to see what can we unpeel and unravel pertaining to Canada, right? How does that power projection work in Ottawa, in Montreal, and different provinces? So one of the paradoxes that I was chewing on was Ben Franklin, and the it had been brought at that time to my attention that Ben Franklin had been in Canada in April of 1776 for 5 weeks. And it was an old professor from the Université de Montréal that I was working with at the time who was very sympathetic to what we were doing, who brought this to my attention. And he even wrote a series of essays that I later on published in the form of this book called The Tragic Consequences of the Quebec Act of 1774. It's the first volume of the Untold History of Canada book series I published. His name was Pierre Baudry. And then I did volume two, volume three, volume four in the ensuing years, but I still didn't fully piece it together. But that was a good splinter in my mind. It's like, why was Benjamin Franklin here? Why did Benjamin Franklin set up Canada's postal service? Why did Benjamin Franklin, of all people in the world, it was Benjamin Franklin that set up Canada's first printing press, our newspaper, the Montreal Gazette, which still exists. And unfortunately, he'd be rolling in his grave to see how it's been used over over the next 250 years, but it still exists. So of all people, why was it him who was creating these Canadian cultural institutions, and not somebody from the British Empire? Why was the founder of the founding fathers who was doing this? And why did he leave unsuccessful? Why was he saddened to depart without achieving his aims of getting Canada, a Canadian delegation, to go down to sign the Declaration of Independence as the 14th of the 13 other colonies? And that was just the gateway into a new picture that began to emerge when I pursued that, where I started pulling on that thread and started then seeing, well, who were the active agencies of the Jesuits that were aligned with the British Foreign Office after the 7 Years' War had been completed in 1763. It had exerted a vast amount of influence over the Canadian system, the psyche of the French Canadians, but also of many of the native tribes that were being manipulated by those very same Jesuits who wanted to who wanted to weaponize all people for all times and infiltrate. They were very good at infiltrating. Ben Franklin had a lot of successes. This was one of his only failures. So that began to open up the door of like, well, what else? What else is a part of this story? Why did we get these bursts of progress? Right. That's my fundamental question: is where did these bursts of progress come from? Was there a fight, or was it given to us by an empire that was maybe bored of watching her colony stagnate, and so gave us infrastructure, gave us scientific progress at different moments? Was it just given, or was there a fight? Sure enough, when you start asking that question, you could find, as I found, and others that were working in my line of research too, there was a fight. Nothing was given. It was always fought for. And so going to British Columbia, that was, I think, for me, I'm saying it the way I'm sort of subjectively, because that's sort of where my heart was at. That was what my motive and my focus of attention was when I was on the plane. And I was like, I don't know what to say to these people, but I have this stuff I've been chewing on for a couple of years. So it was started to piece together, and I think I had to give myself this uncomfortable situation of going and speaking to whatever it was, 60, 70 people who wanted some advice, some insight, some guidance about what do we do. They're into conspiracy theories, they're piecing things together, but they don't know what to do. And I've got a bit of an idea, but it's still not clear. So on the plane, I began to realize, okay, Canada's identity is largely a battle between two systems. This American system, because we have a lot of similarities to our American cousins below the border, but we also, the system that emerged after 1776 in the United States has been at diametrical odds with the British system, which also uses the English language, but has a very different philosophical world outlook, a different cosmology, a different idea of human nature than that which we've seen coming out of the US Declaration of Independence and the Battle of 1776. One has the idea that mankind is made to be ruled over by a hereditary elite, and that the rights that are permitted into society can be taken away or given by a sovereign, but that sovereign's claim to power is based entirely upon their blood. And as we saw Mark Carney and earlier Justin Trudeau and earlier Stephen Harper proclaim when they did their oath of office to become members of the Privy Council, it's not just to the crown, in this case, His Majesty King Charles III, but to his heirs into perpetuity, and to do as a good sovereign ought to do for His Majesty. So this language is very indicative of a deeper philosophical view of how governance should work and how local managers, viscounts, should be wired to pay homage and to serve an interest that you, as you pointed out, should be the people, should be, the nation, but it's not. It's this other thing, which isn't new. It's very old. These are opposing ideas compared to the American view that no, rights are inalienable. Rights are there. It's baked into the writing of the Declaration of Independence of the Constitution. That rights are inalienable. Purpose of law is to fulfill the general welfare, which is based upon the consent of the governed that gives authority to the law. These are really important concepts, which are denied by those who maintain a view of the other thing, of the oligarchical system of government. And Canada's caught in the middle. At different moments, we've had people who emerged inspired by the American example and did what they could in Canada to act accordingly to their conscience and to what they believe natural law to be in the best sense of the word. Often these people were subverted by something they didn't usually understand very well, baked into this deep state structure of the Privy Council, of the lieutenant governors of this. And when I say Privy Council office, the Privy Council is more than the 380 or so people who make up the Privy Council, some public, some private. Charles Bronfman was a member, Maurice Strong was a member, people in official, the elected part of government or the Senate are members, but it's something which is also overseen by King Charles III, who's the head of the Canadian Privy Council. But it's more than that. It's the Privy Council office is a massive integral body controlling the civil service of Canada, which has deep penetrations into each of the provinces. So you've got this whole underbelly, right? Which many of these good people didn't fully understand. But who are these good people? How do I know who they were? And, as the Bible says, by their fruits you shall know them. And so the thing I had in my mind at the time, we were campaigning in the United States for, this is in 2010, 11, we began campaigning for a certain big infrastructure water project called NWAPA, the North American Water and Power Alliance, because of a very predictable outcome, water scarcity that was very foreseeable within a decade or two. It's a fact, and you can just see it right now. There's a huge farming crisis. There's a lack of water distribution on the continent, and there was an old project that John F. Kennedy and his brother were fans of, and had a lot of support in Canada in the early 60s and late 50s, called the North American Water and Power Alliance. That called for capturing about 5 or 10% of the water runoff in Alaska and North Yukon, and then it's a big project, but it called for basically creating reservoirs, dams, lifts, pumps, channels to move about 10% of that water runoff down into the continent. So distribute it with a new canal into the Great Lakes to clean up the Great Lakes, replenish, refill, move hydroelectric power, also down the Rocky Mountain Trench, which would have used Earth's natural gravitational forces to move that water. Something like 79 dams would be built up that would produce something like 100 gigawatts of power down into the continent, into California, Texas, north of Mexico. So it was a big project. It was a multi-generational idea. It was pretty grandiose, but it was stopped because the Malthusians took over the John F. Kennedy's dead body. And the new paradigm of the late 60s became no more big projects, just adapt to scarcity. And so all of these things were abandoned. They were all jettisoned, but there was some maneuvers in British Columbia that were moving us in that direction. And one of the allies of John F. Kennedy was a premier in BC by the name of William Cecil Bennett, who was his enemies called Wacky Bennett. And he was premier there for like 20 years from 1952 until 1972. And he was a fan of this. And he actually was so people know that British Columbia has a lot of hydroelectric power. It's got the Peace River Dam complex in the north. It's got the Columbia River Tree Basin in the south, which it has a variety of dams of reservoirs in the south of BC that was built up under JFK. Well, first under FDR and then JFK amplified it. Also rail. There was a lot of rail built up under Diefenbaker, a lot of industrial power built up under him. The nationalization of this private agency called Power Corporation of BC. Its sister branch was in Quebec called Power Corp Quebec. Earlier on, it was the Montreal Light and Traction that also controlled a lot of Brazil's hydroelectric power and infrastructure under the Bronfmans, which are tied to Mayor Lansky and that whole strange Zionist crime syndicate. Very, very, very powerful institution. I mentioned Charles Bronfman was a privy councillor. His whole family was very much baked in. I would say they were more powerful and probably still are than even the Mayor Lansky networks in the United States. But that's what ran Quebec's hydroelectric power. That's what ran British Columbia's hydroelectric power, and it was not permitting the type of real growth that Bennett had envisioned for British Columbia and its people. So he had through his work building alliances with American senators and allies of JFK, was able to make some amazing inroads and begin the process of building the first phase of the North American Water and Power Alliance, which became the north of BC, the Liard River system, the Peace River program, all of that stuff was built up, as well as the south, as part of what would become the next phase, which would be the phase 2 of NAWAPA. He also did a rail line, which he envisioned to tie into Alaska. And I think today he built it all the way up into the north of Beast Lake. And it became a joke after he was ousted. And the Green Zero Growth crowd came in once he was gone and put a cap on it. They stopped everything and it became a joke. And it was called the Rail to Nowhere. They were trying to sell it for like $1. And they don't realize that, no, he had a grand vision of tying this into Arctic program, into the Yukon, into Alaska, especially Alaska, which is much more advanced in terms of developing mining and developing its infrastructure. And I think he had a broader view as well, a hope that in the future, an idea of the historic rail line across the Bering Strait would manifest. And this is something that Abraham Lincoln's networks had been fighting for. I was surprised to discover that a lot of people knew about this in the 19th century. Tsar Alexander II was a major fan of, and the third, and Nicholas II, who got ousted in the Bolshevik Revolution and killed. They were all consciously speaking about and implementing policies to advance the Bering Strait rail tunnel to effectively connect the old world of Russia and Eurasia through rail that was being built up in the 1880s, 1890s into North America via Alaska, which Russia had sold after the Civil War. And that was another question. It's like, well, why was British Columbia, why didn't they join the United States? That was another question. I had a few days to prepare my presentation and pull my thoughts together. I was like, looking at the 19th century, especially after the U.S. Civil War, when the British Empire had become exposed by many people in the world, began to realize the duplicity, the power, the real evil that was represented through the city of London and its global efforts to create wars and depopulation in India and opium wars in China, and the British were caught in the world's first international court case in The Hague in 1871 for having sponsored the Confederacy and provided warships illegally to the Confederates who were doing the Civil War. That was the British who were doing all of these things internationally, spreading themselves very thin. They had done the Crimean War. They entrapped Russia into a very destructive sort of Vietnam style Crimean War in the 1850s, 1852, 53, 54, 55. It was a big destructive thing that nearly annihilated Russia. It was a big wake up call as well under Russia, where they began to realize that they have to work with their American allies more closely against this global British deep state. And the sale of Alaska was a big part of that. And the big question was, well, it seems like there was a big movement, very popular movement at the time in the 1860s and 70s in British Columbia to join the United States. You had not just the US Congress saying it, they were passing bills to annex Canada after the Civil War because, you know, Canada wasn't a sovereign country. Canada was British Canada. It was a British pseudo nation that was basically a giant base of operations to destroy the United States from above. That was better understood. But you had the annexation petitions of British Columbia's business elites all saying, "Hey, we have no future with the British Empire. Let's just join the United States." That's 95% of our businesses with San Francisco and the US anyway. So if we were to stay British, it's a weird situation because we're separated by 3,000 kilometers from the other British colonies of Upper and Lower Canada, of today's Quebec and Ontario and the Maritimes. Because, there was nothing else. There was just this privately owned 75% of Canada's land between British Columbia colony and Upper and Lower Canada. That was all just simply Hudson's Bay land, private Hudson's Bay land. Oh, you're on mute.
Who owned Rupert's Landing or Rupert's
It was a board of
land?
directors and a private shareholders that had a lot of overlap with the British East India Company. The British East India Company had earlier merged after the British Civil War with the Dutch, the Dutch East India Company. They kind of had a little bit of a battle, then a merger leading up to the British Glorious Revolution. And it was at that time that the East India Company, which actually coined their own paper money, they had their own printing press, they had their own private army that was bigger than the official British army, English army itself. They they integrated more with the political dynamics of the British Empire, and that's sort of the moment I think in 1688, a big moment when you saw the birth of the loss of potential for England to regain its efforts to be a genuine sovereign country. And this other thing began to really metastasize through the use of a very perverse idea of capitalism. Because the success of this new type of empire was that it would market itself to the world as being liberal. We're just out to do business. That's why you should, lower your protective tariffs. You should open up to opium. You could open up to whatever we're going to flood into your local markets. And it's just business. It's nothing personal. It's not like we want to hurt you. If you happen to get hurt, it's probably because you weren't doing business as wisely as you should have. Not our fault. So that became this British Anglo-Dutch technique called Anglo-Dutch liberalism that manifested in this way that we saw certain propagandists hired to advance and give more contour to this system, like Adam Smith, who was commissioned by Jeremy Bentham to publish a book in 1776, not coincidentally, the same moment that something else was happening across the ocean. But The Wealth of Nations of Adam Smith was commissioned by the British Empire that he was always devoted to adhering to make an argument under sociological, mathematical language based on total fallacy. But if you believed it, you would have to conclude, well, I guess to be a proper capitalist, I shouldn't allow trade barriers, I shouldn't have protective tariffs, and I should believe somehow that there are these invisible hands organizing the markets, and that the markets are the only way to mindlessly just allow for society to move forward. And just allowing the markets to be the markets means no planning, no thinking about future as far as having the nation play a role in the destiny of where things go. No, that's bad. That's bad practice. And so the reality was the servants or the people who commissioned Adam Smith always knew that they were not going to follow those rules. Those were rules for their victims to follow on the big great game. They were always going to break the rules. They were never going to, because it works. Adam Smith's ideas of free trade, they work if everybody's honest. If everybody's actually just really caring about, building a better future, having good, healthy competition, you, sure, it's fine. The reality is that there's the British East India Company, there's the City of London, there's these globalist, massive behemoths that don't care about the rules that we follow. And the British Empire, one of the points of hypocrisy is that while they always promoted free trade to their victims in India and China and the colonies and Canada, they promoted it to everybody else, but they didn't really apply it to themselves as they grew their industry. So that's how Britain gained a monopoly over industrial power that they then used as a power to keep control over the rest of the world. Was they used protectionism for their own markets. And so there's always this loud hypocrisy going on in England itself. But all that to say, that seems to be what controlled the Hudson's Bay Company. Is sort of, you could see it as an appendage of the British East India Company in many ways. And they always ensured that Canada's hinterland, what became the prairies, most of the Arctic, this was set up under Rupert's Land in, I think it was 1670 something. Originally, it was only nationalized in 1870, 1869 or so. The policy was always to keep Canada underdeveloped, to make sure that we remain a land of hewers of wood, of drawers of water, nothing more. That's our destiny. No industry, no manufacturing. That shouldn't be what we expect of ourselves. And so that was always the Hudson Bay policy, always. So British Columbia again was very choked off. They were isolated. They were in massive debts. There was a gold boom and bust in the 1850s and early 60s. So they were choking under debt. They had no economy. It was bad. There was starvation going on. And the Americans actually had a different spirit. They were much more optimistic about their idea of building up industry and nature, and they wanted to help British Columbia. And British Columbia was like, okay, look, let's do this. So why did they fail? Same kind of question as I was asking early on. Why did Quebec fail, or why did Canada fail when Ben Franklin was up here, right? Why did we fail to accept that very common sense offer when we had that chance? From there, the story began to make more sense. Like, okay, why did Russia sell Alaska to the Americans in 1867 at this very specific moment? I think it was May of 1867, right before the Canadian British North America Act was signed into law, creating today's first constitution, which is a garbage constitution. When you actually read the thing philosophically, it's trash. It pretty much says that we exist to promote the interests of the British Empire in our preamble. And people say, oh, but it doesn't exist anymore. It was superseded by acts of Westminster in the 1930s. And then it was superseded again by the Charter of Rights of Freedoms under Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And it's like, no, if you actually look at either the 1930s or the 1980, 81, 82 charter, BNA Act is still recognized as the principal constitution. It's that these things are just simply appendices to the still existent, still active constitution of 1867. So it's like that. Is it all just a coincidence that these things just happened when they did? Is it just a coincidence that the pro-American movement was disassembled and its leader, its defender, a governor named Frederick Seymour, British, actually Irish governor in British Columbia, who was protecting the annexationists, the pro-American crowd was being protected by this governor, Frederick Seymour, who ends up dying a very mysterious death right at a moment when he's trying to postpone and buy time for the annexation movement to succeed so that they could join the US. And as soon as he's out, his enemy, Osimo de Medore, Amore or something, he's brought in basically a stooge for Johnny Macdonald, who's one of the worst human beings I've ever read about. When you look at like the real Johnny Macdonald, I know he's celebrated, and this might hurt the feelings of some people listening to the show, but I gotta say, as far as like role models, fake role models are concerned, this guy's a scumbag. What a This guy wanted to create. Let's just. I know I'm ranting, but
No,
uh,
this is good. I mean, Johnny
yeah,
Macdonald, he may be like the Anthony Fauci of politics, of Canadian politics. So,
yeah,
yeah, tell us about Johnny McDonald. I mean, and it's interesting, Matthew, like the picture that I mean, there's so many handholds to this, but as you're revealing some of the handholds, is Benjamin Franklin, the founder of the founding fathers, who, as ex-Brits, were really declaring war and saying, we're done being slaves to the British Empire. We're going to have our own country. We're going to pursue our own ambitions. We're going to have rule of law rather than rule of the monarchy. That he literally went on a major project to this region, which we call Canada, to get everyone else to say, "Hey, let's all be free."
yeah,
And he was not successful. And now you're starting to show us a history of, for instance, in BC, they're trying to free Canadian, trying to free people in this region and trying to say, hey, let's be like a legitimate, ruled by law, like a republic, like all the states are, and join this union of, I mean, the concept sounds good. I know it all goes a little bit south when the Federal Reserve shows up, but that's another issue for the American side of it.
Yeah.
But so Johnny Macdonald, who, you're quite correct. I mean, things are named after him and pictures of him everywhere, founding father of Canada, which it turns out we're realizing is more of a slave colony of Canada. Tell us a little bit about Johnny Macdonald. For not, you know, don't worry about the propaganda and all the garbage everybody's been told. Just
Yeah.
like you've done a ton of research, just tell us a bit about Johnny Macdonald and his role in our history.
Yeah, he's famous for having claimed, "A Britisher I was born and a Britisher I will die." Strange words for the sort of George Washington of Canada, as a beacon and icon of Canadian independence or whatever, the Canadian nation idea. Strange, strange words. He also said, "I would rather leave Canada a barren wasteland, except that I know that if we don't go there, then the Yankees will." And so he was describing his preference to not develop Canada, to not build the transcontinental railway that he's given credit for, because it's true, he did build it. But the reason why he built it was dishonest, and it was very indicative what he admitted openly in a speech, that he simply did it because it was the lesser evil. And he knew that the dynamics, the momentum of the zeitgeist of the age that he lived in, it was very popular to think about the next generation, to build something better for the next generation. That was the ethos that was very much inspired by the American cause and the American victory over the British directed civil war in the US that nearly broke things apart and undid 1776. But again, you could learn a lot by people could learn so much by looking at the strategy, the strategic thinking and philosophy of higher quality minds who didn't fall for those traps, like Abraham Lincoln and his allies like Henry C. Carey. And I mean, there's William Seward, the guy who oversaw the purchase of Alaska, his Secretary of State, who survived 20 stab wounds the night that Lincoln was killed. That same William Seward had a very, very deep intellect. And there were many others who understood this, including those in Canada, like Frederick Seymour, the governor of British Columbia. So Macdonald was anti-development. He was pro-British Empire. He himself was he called for an Aryan Canada. He pushed legislation saying that this new country, this new federation that he will oversee, in his early days as prime minister, he said it must be an Aryan confederation, and that only citizens who have Aryan blood with a Teutonic twist may be permitted to be recognized as citizens with rights. And people say, "Oh, that eugenics stuff that he was for and that Aryan stuff, that was just the times. Forgive the man. He was a creature of his time." And it's like, well, actually, he was the only one he in Parliament, the only one. Everyone else was correctly horrified by this proposition. So it wasn't that he was a creature of his times. He was standing for his principles that he believed in very firmly. There's a lot more to say, but he very, very dirty character. And he gets his asset put in over the dead body of Seymour, who's sent up to go and sort of where he's told he has to go and help oversee some dispute between these two Inuit tribes. And he quickly dies. He comes back dead. So we have no idea what happened, but it's convenient because at that moment, BC is streamlined into confederation at that moment. So within weeks, BC's integrated. There's a bribe given by Ottawa, well, by London, saying, "Okay, if you sign on, we will erase your debts. We'll even build a rail line connecting you, British Columbia, to the rest of the eastern colonies. So you won't be all isolated anymore. And we'll even nationalize the Hudson's Bay land to make it happen," because Hudson's Bay land was not allowing these types of things to happen. So the bribes were accepted. It took 15 more years for the rail. It was way over budget and way longer than it was supposed to, but it did finally happen. And BC was enmeshed back into the system. Now there's a quote that was very useful to pull this story together, and I'll just read it here, by Lord Alfred Milner. So okay, actually I won't read that quote yet. The main battle line, there was a figure, a Republican figure who wanted a Republic of Canada in 1863-64, and his name was Isaac Buchanan. And I used him in my speech, and when I landed and I gave the presentation, I brought him into my speech because he was the head of the Liberal Party at the time. He was an enemy of Johnny Macdonald. He was also an enemy of George Brown. George Brown and Johnny Macdonald are two founding fathers, but who were also sold to us as oppositional enemies. Not true. They were actually playing two sides of the same game. One was playing a fake protective tariff nationalist game, Johnny Macdonald. The other one, George Brown, was playing who ran the Globe and Mail, or the Globe, which became the Globe and Mail, still active. He was playing the free trade game, but it was a controlled dialectic. Both were devoted to the same ancient hereditary system of empire, and were working together in the same way that René Lévesque and Pierre Trudeau. If people want to think about how this kind of game is played, sort of a similar thing. They seem like enemies from the bottom up, but they're actually two Jesuit trained operatives who are working for the exact same technocratic anti-Christian movement in Quebec in the 1950s and 60s. They were both friends and allies at Cité Libre that was dismantling and destroying Jesuitically the traditional healthy aspects of the Christian culture within Quebec in order to break the will and the fight of the Quebecois and reabsorb them back into the British Empire. So the
Can I
real
ask,
opposite.
can I ask you to, Matthew, can I just ask you
Yep,
to elaborate on that a bit? Because a lot of times when people hear the word anti-Christian, like
yep.
anti-Christ, they think it means evil. But in this case, you're talking about a very organized program that went on over years, as I
Mhm.
understand from prior exposure to your work, that Pierre Trudeau was part of this, which was literally I forget the exact name, the program for the de-Christianization of Quebec. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because otherwise people might pass, oh, he just meant evil. No, he means like a literal program.
Oh yeah, it was thought through. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like there were neurotic problems in the way that the Catholic schools were organized, certain authoritarian problems that are baked into the behavior of how many institutions were organized in Quebec. So I'm not trying to just say it was all good. However, there was something about the strong Christian culture, especially of Quebec, which made it very difficult for Satanists to do whatever they wanted to do and to bring in certain ideas into the schools, into health administration, other things, like, for example, the passing of sterilization laws that were being enacted by other provinces like Alberta, British Columbia in the 1920s were acting upon, were making eugenics law for sterilization of the unfit in both provinces, 30 US states, starting with Illinois in 1907, all the way up until the 1930s, where 30 US states were passing forced sterilization laws of the unfit over eugenics boards of experts that were overseeing these things.
So
This
you're,
was,
you're meaning that people that were evaluated as being unfit mentally or physically would be forcibly sterilized by the state, and this was going on, sounds like on a lot of North America at that time.
oh yeah, Hitler emulated his eugenics policies, including the Tiergarten 4 program. He was inspired by the example that had been set in Canada and the United States earlier, but well before they started doing it in Germany. They just did it more in a more robust way in Germany, but it had already been going on in North America long before that. But the sponsorship of it included things like the Josiah Macy Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, which was sponsoring these things both in North America, in Canada, but also in Germany too. So yeah, they weren't having much luck. The biggest resistance they were finding was the Quebecois that had a very well organized activist base that were able to deploy very effective teams into Kentucky legislatures across Canada. Like they weren't just fighting it from coming into Quebec; they were fighting it across the continent. It was very impressive, and you could see the writings of eugenicists in the main review at the time was the Eugenical Review, published from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, even after Nazism, they still were publishing this thing. And in 1947, the Eugenical Review was publishing articles critical of these damn Quebecois Catholics who are just making it very difficult to pass our bills in the United States. They were
Wow.
also very resistant to the school reforms that were being pushed in the 1950s, especially under the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, that was overseeing the reform, and UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Science, and Cultural Organization, overseen by the president of the Eugenics Society, Julian Huxley, who was the founder and overlord of UNESCO, which was, again, overseeing the transformation of school systems, of curricula around Europe and North America after World War II. And they were not having the progress that they were enjoying elsewhere in Quebec, because the idea of bringing in Darwin and moving Darwin's theory from simply a theory into a fact was not being accepted. And that's one thing like solid Christians kind of detect very quickly when the divinity of human beings is being challenged by a doctrine, some pseudo secular doctrine that tries to reduce us to the status of some other animal. And if you could, if you could call overpopulated chickens or cows, why can't you do the same thing to humans? We're the same DNA, the same flesh, the same emotions. We all get hungry, we all get sad and happy. Chickens get happy, and so do cows, and so do humans. So it must be the same thing qualitatively, right? And maybe we're even worse. We're descended from monkeys. We're not, so it wasn't meeting a lot of success. And so the whole movement that Pierre Elliott Trudeau was initiated into in the late 40s. Keep in mind, I think he was in last year of high school during World War II. He was a major fascist. He was a big fan of Adrien Arcand, the Quebec Nazi, the Führer of Quebec, who ran the blue shirts. So he was openly celebrating Quebec synarchist fascism in the 1940s. He quickly moved from that into, and again, he was Jesuit education trained. He took pride in a new biography of Trudeau that came out a few years ago, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Some of his early writings take pride in how excited he was that he was invited into certain secret societies. They don't say what those were. His archived papers and things are still under lock and key under a family estate. So you have to be only a vetted historian to be permitted access to those things. So you have to be pretty much committed to writing fluff pieces if you're going to have access to those records. His other records that were public, by the way, something like 800 boxes or some ridiculous number of boxes that were public in the National Archives. I got to just say this. In 2019, after 20 years, so when somebody dies, you got to wait 20 years. He died in 1999. So historians finally were going to have access to all of the RCMP files of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, everything else. They were finally excited because finally we could access these things that have been under red tape. And they got there and they were told by the archivist of Archives Canada, actually we destroyed all of that back in like 1989 because we didn't think it was relevant and we wanted more space in our archival room. So they're gone now. Such as to say.
Wow. Wow.
Um,
Well, I mean, Pierre, I guess he'd be proud of the more recent move to delete emails after 15 to 30 days.
oh yeah. Yeah, he'd be happy with
Wow.
that.
The,
So all that to say, he was recruited into something weird and he quickly was brought into the Fabian Society. So he was sent off quickly to first Harvard, where he was trained he was in the class of Henry Kissinger under this guy, William Yandell Elliott, who was a British Rhodes Scholar who ran a major, powerful institution in Harvard that trained many high level elites. Zbigniew Brzezinski was trained under him. So was Samuel P. Huntington. Pierre Trudeau had a lot of talent and was sent off from Harvard to go to the London School of Economics, where he directly worked under Harold Laski, who was the head of the Labour Party of England and the guy who ran. He was the head of the Fabian Society of those days, very closely aligned with Julian Huxley and John Maynard Keynes. And so at that point, he's fully initiated. He is a Fabian. And he's brought back after doing this tour in 1949, 1950. It's a 500-day tour where he's basically given, he's like a rich kid from a, silver spoon in his mouth, has got the right psychological profile. He's got everything that they want. So he's given a tour of the empire. He's does this famous thing where he goes to Lebanon, gets thrown into a jail as a spy, and he talks about how every single place I went through revolutions. Isn't that interesting? And he's basically learning the ropes. And then he's sent back to immediately go to Ottawa, and he's set up in the Privy Council office to sort of learn the nerve center, the central nervous system of Canada, of the real deep state. And so he does that for a couple of years. And while he's doing that, he's bouncing back to Montreal, to Ottawa, and he's working with this grouping in the Université de Laval. And there's this hub at the Université de Laval, and this guy, Georges Henri Levesque, who's a Dominican, but he might be Benedictine. I think he's Dominican, nominally Dominican monk teacher. He's the father of Quebec sociology. He's also a fan of Aldous Huxley. He's a fan of the Brave New World. He believes that that's the best way to organize society. And he's got a lot of Rhodes Scholars at a little think tank that he sets up at the Université de Laval, which include Pierre Trudeau. And it was in that think tank that they unleashed something that a young René Lévesque also is a part of. And this is called Cité Libre, 1953, I think. And basically, Cité Libre becomes a very popular propaganda tool, a news magazine, has outlets also into the radio. But it's a big news magazine published every month to promote existentialism, nihilist philosophers, just basically, you know, postmodernist crap theories of human nature and governance, and basically it's designed to make young people become atheistic slaves and despise Christianity. So it's how they declare war on the Christian institutions, especially those represented by the Union Nationale government. Now, the Union Nationale government, for those who don't know, that is the dominant political party of the 1950s and 60s. When you actually had, people are told, especially those in Quebec who are baby boomers, they tend to have a very disgusted feeling, but it's not very reasonable. It's more of this feeling of how much they hate the Union Nationale times of Duplessis, of Paul Sauvé, of Daniel Johnson, who were the premiers at different times under the Union Nationale, which was at war with these atheists that were infiltrating our systems and slowly taking over. But that was actually some of the biggest periods of progress that Quebec had. You know, a lot of the hydroelectric power that we saw being built was during this time. Of course, the Jesuits that were controlling a lot of the schools were consciously, I think they were consciously trying to screw up the heads of a lot of kids. They were being very abusive. And the kids who were suffering the trauma and the abuse by their Jesuit sort of teachers. I mean, my father went through this, had horror stories of abuse. I think it was systemic and conscious. They started blaming all of Christianity, and they became sort of the first generation baby boomers, right, who were taking pride in their liberation from Christianity. But, so I think part of that is a bit of a dark, disgusting game of you make the Christian institutions as rigid and tyrannical as they can possibly be, and then you create oppositional movements that capture people who naturally will want to rebel from that abuse. And then you create that Rosicrucian kind of enlightened feeling of liberty, but it's not really liberty. It's more of a do what thou wilt will be the whole of your law kind of liberty. It's more libertinism. And that's sort of the technique that they've been doing for centuries. You can see this manifesting in the crock pot of human history for centuries and centuries as a technique. But all that to say, the better people like Paul Sauvé, who dies a really weird, mysterious death in 1959 after like 4 months of being premier of Quebec, after Duplessis dies. He's known as like the Martin Luther King of Quebec. He's like a World War II veteran. He's a really good human being, and he's like fighting against this oligarchy, all of these like pro-fascist systems. Because Adrien Arcand, the Quebec Nazi, he didn't come to power by himself. He had a whole complex of deep embedded power around him that didn't get resolved after World War II, and that thing was at war with Paul Sauvé and the Union Nationale. Now, I'll say one thing here is that the name Union Nationale as a political party came out of the Union Nationale Journal. That was a journal that was created in 1863. I'm doing some bouncing around here, but I'm hoping people can follow.
That's
And I'm
good.
hoping this also inspires them to want to read my books. But this journal had as one of its key members and leaders a fellow who became prime minister, who's one of the few really good prime ministers that I will say we do have, which was Wilfrid Laurier. Wilfrid Laurier was part of a Quebec patriotic grouping inspired by Louis Joseph Papineau's fight to create a Republic of Quebec in the 1830s. And they were part of this very, very disciplined network. You had L.O. David, another leader of this grouping. I wrote about them on the Canadian Patriot website. But they were fighting at that time. Because you had Republicans in British Columbia on the Pacific coast, so too did you have Republicans in Quebec during the American Civil War fighting to say, okay, well, let's use this opportunity, the crisis during the Civil War, come out of this as an independent republic modeled on the best of the US example. Or some of them were also for the idea of just joining the US outright. I'm agnostic, if you've got a good, healthy America, it could be a good thing to do that. Similarly, if America falls and becomes too corrupt, you don't want to do that. So it's the time I think there was sufficient morality in a good position in America that it would have been a viable thing to join the US. Or, if we had good leadership here, we could have become our own thing. But either way, Either way, the outcome was largely to break away from the British Empire. That was going to be no matter what. Everyone agreed on that. So the Union Nationale program was really good. However, their major nemesis was Georges-Étienne Cartier, another founding father, nominally another enemy of Macdonald's, but not really. They worked together in creating the BNA Act, but he was controlled opposition. And what they did when they realized that they couldn't stop the BNA Act, Confederation was going to happen. Their whole purpose of fighting it kind of disassembled. At that point, Wilfrid Laurier, who's a genuine admirer of Abraham Lincoln, he says, "Okay, I'm going to try to infiltrate and fight inside of these new institutions," and he does a pretty good job. By the 1890s, he becomes prime minister, and he actually goes pretty far in staying alive at a time when it's very dangerous in the late 1890s, early 1900s, before World War One. It's very dangerous if you are a moral Republican leader anywhere in the world. To stay alive is very tough. McKinley's getting killed. You've got Alexander the Third dying. It's a big list. Garfield had just been assassinated by anarchists. It's a big list. I think even Darcy McGee, who was also sold an Irish Canadian founding father, he was also stabbed to death. And I think he was changing when I look at some of what he was doing and saying at that time. I think he was waking up to how Confederation was actually a trap and began to get off the reservation, so to speak, and had to be eliminated. But anyway, so he actually ends up becoming prime minister and spends years planning overtly with allies of McKinley, who had earlier gotten killed in 1901, to create this Canada USA free trade customs union with a protective tariff around this new union. It was modeled on the idea of a German Zollverein of Otto von Bismarck that had unified Germany from its previous situation, which was a very divided Germany run by localized princelings, little warlords, basically, with localized mini armies that made it very easy to control through divide and conquer. And it wasn't a real country with a singular identity. And under Bismarck, who was an admirer of America, was able to use the American example of Hamilton and company to apply it to Germany in the 1850s, 60s, 70s to create this customs union that allowed Germany to finally triple its industrial capacity, to elevate its culture, to create the best scientists and artists in the world, and really rival the British Empire. And that had to be destroyed because they were also working with like-minded people in Russia and the United States and in Canada. So Laurier's success was like 1911. He was like, finally, the purpose of my 15 years of working is finally about to manifest. He got his legislation passed in the Senate, in the House of Commons. And right before he could sign off on it, there was this massive, basically like a Russiagate operation to oust him, run by, as he says, I'll just pull it up here as a quote because it's worth sharing as a statement. So for people who are listening and not watching this show, I do apologize. But this is Laurier reflecting on how he was ousted from the prime ministership in 1911 to his friend Oscar Skelton, who later on becomes a very good foreign minister of Canada. And he's writing in World War I saying, Canada is now governed by a junta sitting at London known as the Round Table, with ramifications in Toronto, in Winnipeg, in Victoria, with Tories and Grits receiving their ideas from London and insidiously forcing them on their respective parties. And what he's referring to in saying this roundtable, which also worked with the Orange Order, this Freemasonic Orange Order of Ontario, which was very popular, as well as the Bourassa crowd that was tied to the Jesuits in Quebec. They were all working together to oust Laurier. This roundtable movement is the foundation of all Rhodes scholarships. It's the foundation of the most powerful think tanks in the world today. At the time, it was run by this guy I have here as a picture, and then I'll stop showing images. This is Lord Alfred Milner, who was a devoted disciple of Cecil Rhodes, whose fortunes, having raped Africa and created Rhodesia and De Beers and Launerho, and there's so many corporations still active to this very day that were created by Cecil Rhodes in order to have imperial management of Africa and to keep Africa underdeveloped and enslaved to this globalist system. So at the time, Theo Amory is in Canada. He actually comes to Canada to come up with a strategy on how to subvert Laurier's efforts to work to integrate Canada's economy with the United States against the City of London. And he says in a message to another roundtable member in 1909, at describing these three pathways possible that have to be understood, and which one we should devote our efforts into stopping and which ones should we amplify. He says, as between the three possibilities of the future, which is number one, closer imperial union. That's deeper integration of the Canadian Confederation with the British Empire. Number two, union with the United States, which was the Laurier approach. Or three, independence. I believe definitely that number two is the real danger. I do not think that Canadians themselves are aware of it. They are wonderfully immature in political reflection on the big issues and hardly realize how powerful the influences are. On the other hand, I see little danger to ultimate imperial unity in Canadian nationalism, air quotes. On the contrary, I think the very same sentiment makes a great many, especially of the younger Canadians, vigorously and even bumptiously assertive of their independence, proud and boastful of the greatness and future of their country, and so forth, would lend themselves, tactfully handled, to an enthusiastic acceptance of imperial unity on the basis of partner states. Air quotes.
Wow, it's like saying, here, let's give you a hat labeled freedom. Now get back picking cotton right away. Here's your hat.
Exactly. Yo, that's perfect. And that's exactly right. That's what was done to the slaves, right? When the slave masters got back into economic control after the Civil War, that's exactly what they did with the sharecropping, right? Is they said, okay, yeah, you can still keep the title freedom if you want, but now at this point, you're gonna just simply work the land. We'll give you 5 cents a day, and you pay us 6 cents a day back for the right to gobble the cotton that you were formerly picking for free. Except now you're going to be in a penny of debt extra every day of working for us. And don't worry, you can just make sure your kids pay us that at some point. You're
So,
right.
so Matthew, is my kind of 30,000 view sketch coming together? Is this accurate? North America, you have a huge movement, 1700s. We don't want to be slaves of the empire anymore. We don't want to live under kings and queens. We want to become an independent state. This takes grip in the southern portion of North America. You have the War of Independence. You have people going back to Franklin Roosevelt and others that say, yeah, let's do this. Let's us become free people as well with rights. Let's develop this nation and be a free people ruled by law, not by overlords. That movement doesn't take traction at the beginning. So the US goes off, becomes independent. We become the United Empire loyalists up here. And it sounds like since then we have recurrent efforts. I mean, you kind of speed forward and you're thinking of Maxime Bernier, but going back, Wilfrid Laurier. But you have a recurrent efforts of people to say, let's liberate Canada, let's create something that's more about us as independent people pursuing our futures, pursuing our happiness, real property rights, all this sort of thing. But you recurrently have a lot of focus of the old empire, of the British, of the City of London. I imagine that brings in the whole banking cartel to propagandize the people, to manipulate the politics, probably to kill a bunch of people like some of our great leaders. And here we are, and we still don't have Republic of Ontario. We've got the provinces and the Westminster system of slavery. Am I kind of seeing the big picture somewhat accurately there?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, unfortunately, that's really the simple sketch is very true the way you've marked it out. I think, like there's this Chinese concept called the mandate of heaven, developed by Mencius, a follower of Confucius. And I think it has analogs with a similar concept that emerged in the Christian world under Augustine and the city of God, which was basically a standard around which human beings can judge law and rulership being legitimate or illegitimate. Since laws can sometimes be illegitimate, systems of governance can sometimes be illegitimate, and how do you decide which is which? And as Augustine pointed out, and a lot of his followers advanced on this, Peter Abelard and others, Raymond Lull advanced on this as theologians and legal scholars, that to the degree that human law conforms with God's law and the law of nature, it's good and should be abided by. And to the degree that it infringes upon God's law, and that includes freedom as well as the laws of physics, it's that's why Benjamin Franklin was also the lead scientist of the world. Like, he didn't differentiate his discoveries of the laws of electricity with what he was thinking about with the laws of human freedom. as two sides of the same thing, as most people didn't. That's a relatively newer innovation of compartmentalized thinking. That's more the product of, I think, a lot of the Rockefeller takeover of science and what have you. But back in those days, you didn't even have the word scientist. You just had natural philosopher, and I think that's a healthier way of thinking about it. So in Mencius's world too, you can read Mencius's writings, and the best Confucian scholars all abide by this very, very clearly. Tianming, the mandate of heaven, that you should follow, and the Mencius literally says, to the degree that an emperor or ruler infringes upon the rights of the governed, it is the duty of the governed to overthrow that government and institute new rules that better conform to Tianming. And that's why Benjamin Franklin, I think, was also, I, I was surprised, but I guess now I shouldn't have been too surprised to discover that he was the first Westerner to publish Confucius's Analects in the US colonies using his printing presses, because he recognized that there's something universal that all human beings of different diverse parts of the world and cultural traditions are all sort of trying to zero in on as a common set of principles that give us an ability to thrive and survive and to create abundance and to overcome oligarchical systems that premise themselves in a common way, whether it's the Chinese tradition of oligarchism or the Indian or the Russian or the British or whatever. The common perennial theme of all of these is that human beings are just another type of animal to be controlled by higher alphas who must control the perceptions of those lower slave castes in some rigid structure of master slave relation. And it might manifest in different myths, like different sacred stories that control the slaves, but it's the same thing. And so inversely, the Renaissance principle that breaks us free of that is also going to have similar common properties. And I think, these greatest thinkers like Ben Franklin and company were very much in tune with that, which is, I think, something we've lacked. We've fallen out of that mode of thinking a little bit too much. I mean, Martin Luther King as well, when you listen to his sermons and you read it, the transcripts of them, if you can't find the audios, there's a reason why he's able to attract Christians and Jews and Muslims and people of all walks of life through the general spirit, not just of civil rights, but of anti-colonialism more broadly and economic justice more broadly. He's not playing this left versus right game, which is why he had to be eliminated. And in his place, agents who would conform more to the rules of the game. If you're going to be a leftist, you had to be a Rockefeller, Ford Foundation kind of leftist, right? The kind that's going to be able to plant Maoist, Leninist bombs in department stores and want to kill Whitey or something. And if you're going to be on the right, if you're going to be a conservative, you got to be the right kind of conservative, the kind who's going to not be afraid of going to your local clan and organizing to string up an example, in a lynch mob. And that would be and defend the Jim Crow laws. Those are the good kinds of conservatives that we want. But the kinds of today, if you actually look at Martin Luther King's general outlook, he would probably be classified, even though he was known as a liberal of his day, as a right-wing conservative, today. It's like, so what would have been the correct thing for Canada to do at different moments is not always the same thing. So like NAFTA was not the same thing as Laurier's idea of North American integration, because I would say at that time, by the time NAFTA came around under Mulroney, the U.S. had lost its claim to the mandate of heaven, right? That moral righteousness that it had by defending through life and death common principles as they had in the Civil War, and in the wake of that, that gave them a moral authority to be something that merited integrating with. After JFK was killed and America was economically reconquered and culturally dismantled, over decades, it became more of an empire. It started acting more and more like that very thing it broke away from centuries earlier, and lost the claim to moral high ground. And so I would say at that point, NAFTA would not have been a good thing. And it wasn't a good thing. It was consciously designed to destroy the manufacturing base, both of Canada and the United States, which is exactly what happened, which is why it's not even a failure. Like Bruce Party had noted, same thing. NAFTA, it was a screaming success. It did exactly what those who administered it, who drafted it, exactly what they wanted it to do. It did. That's a different thing. Now today, again, the question of at different moments, I mentioned Laurier. Diefenbaker was a pretty solid, one of the few solid populist prime ministers that we had. We haven't had many. He was probably one of the few. Mackenzie King and his team under C.D. Howe, Clarence Decatur Howe, and O.D. Skelton. It's pretty good. Few little moments that we had on a federal level where real mints had power, had influence. The solution in those times, I would say, would have strategically have been to fight for the federal thing, like so use your strategy. And maybe there's something. I don't see it though today, but maybe there is. Maxime Bernier, I'm sympathetic to him, but I don't. I find it difficult to see where it can work. Take federal government, and I'm open to being refuted. But in those times, yeah, it's like use that Bank of Canada that Mackenzie King nationalized. Use it, direct it as an instrument for growth. It could be. It hasn't been, but it could be. Feasibly that. Inversely, at different moments, when W.A.C. Bennett built up the industrial boom of British Columbia, what did he do? He had no support. Diefenbaker was not able to help him. He was kind of left cut and dry because Diefenbaker had a bunch of British Rhodes scholars running his administration. He didn't fully understand it. He still admired the British Empire. He didn't understand the evil that it actually was. So he was taking briefing calls from the Privy Council and from the Queen Elizabeth herself, was briefing Diefenbaker, telling him what to do tomorrow. And he took pride in that. He didn't realize how stupid he was by believing these people actually cared about him. They were trying to subvert his northern vision, the Avro Arrow program that was cut down under his oversight. He didn't even realize that was happening. That they were going to just chop down and destroy the world's first hypersonic planes in the world. We're into scrap metal under him, and he's hated for that to this day. But he was stupid. He didn't realize what they were planning. I think he did want to help W.A.C. Bennett, but he was not equipped for that fight. So Bennett had to go at it by himself. And what did he do? He used the power of the province. Section 92 of the BNA Act gave provinces a lot of autonomous power to have full control over their economic destiny as long as it's within the provincial boundaries themselves. And he did that really good. He nationalized Power Core BC. He fought and he nationalized it with a fight and turned it into BC Hydro. And then through that, made that an agency for building up very effectively hydroelectric dams and reservoirs and pumps and ports. And he built up the lumber industry and he built up the rail lines as well and the highway systems. So he did all of these things with the power of the province and also with the support of John F. Kennedy. That helps a lot if you can get like a moral Republican leader of a powerful country. In the case of Quebec, you had the Union Nationale that was able to come back to power over the liberals, the technocratic liberals of the 60s, and for 2 years, from 66 to or 67 to 68 or 69. Daniel Johnson became premier of the Union Nationale. He brought in Charles de Gaulle. If he was by himself, I don't think he could have done it. But he had an alliance with Charles de Gaulle, who was fighting against NATO, who was fighting against the Nazi armies, the secret armies of NATO, which were entirely staffed and managed by World War II stay-behinds, including the French fascists of Vichy and the Organisation de l'Armée Secrète, the secret army organization, which tried to kill de Gaulle like 30 times in France. But he had it was because you had a strong Republican leader that was able to provide that type of protection and support to Johnson that he was able to carry out the battles to oversee the Manicouagan Sank 5 hydroelectric, the biggest dam of Quebec's history, which was his pride and joy. And it was the morning that he unveiled it at a press conference, and he the ribbon that he was supposed to cut the ribbon. That was it. He didn't cut the ribbon because he was dead. They came to his house. He was dead. And he couldn't follow through on his plans to help out de Gaulle with the broader anti-colonial plans that de Gaulle had in mind for Africa and for much of the world, which was happening in tandem with Bobby Kennedy, and who had an alliance with Martin Luther King. There's actually a discussion around making Martin Luther King a running mate to Bobby Kennedy if Kennedy hadn't been killed. So, you had this potential. And the answer of like what do we do today isn't always easy. But what I can say is there are things that work, or principles that work to make an empire afraid and lose influence and empower the people. And there's things that you do that make us more enmeshed into that system of empire. And so we could take these lessons today and think, okay, well, we do have certain openings for progress around obviously the independence movement of Alberta is an interesting thing. There's definitely signs of life there. I enjoy speaking to those people and going there every few months to speak to various crowds who are very hungry for higher analysis. They're feeling strengthened by the opportunity right now, and there's a certain momentum that shouldn't be lost. Whether or not it's viable is still, I don't know. I don't know if it's viable yet, because do they have the wits and awareness to navigate through the type of subterfuge and infiltration and sophistication that the empire actually wields? I'm not convinced of that yet. But the discussion around the idea of having sovereign Alberta, maybe that would spread to BC to force discussions in BC that could make the unthinkable become thinkable in a good way. Same thing for Saskatchewan, Manitoba, maybe even Quebec. Separatists have won 4 by-elections in a row in Quebec. There's a certain consensus in even the National Assembly of Quebec that we shouldn't pay homage to the crown. We got our own Masonic problems, you know. There's it's something to work with, but at the same time, I don't know exactly if it's viable entirely. But these are things that I think the unique breakdown of the system that we're living in today, which we're living in a this is many years coming. This stick has been bending for many years, and now that the pressure point buildup is at the max and the break is happening. And here I'm speaking the entire transatlantic system. With these moments of crisis, there are opportunities and openness for ways of thinking that would not be the case if things were in a stable sort of situation. So we can work with that. I know the Russians also have a lot of hope that we can get our heads out of our asses and start working together on Arctic cooperation. There's been a discussion that's been floated for a while now around reviving the Bering Strait rail tunnel. Kirill Dmitriev, who's met with Trump's team on a number of occasions in Florida and in Alaska and Anchorage last year, has floated the concept once again of building a Russia US Bering Strait rail tunnel as a point of healing trust again. Is it possible? Will Carney allow this? Will the British Empire that controls Carney do everything possible to stop this? Does Trump even want it, or is he buying time? Is he just sort of saying words in order to buy time in order to ultimately weaponize the Arctic in preparation for an oncoming assault, a war with Russia via the Arctic, via a golden dome that would be also built up in Greenland? Maybe. I'm not convinced that that's not going to happen. So we're in a very underdetermined time, but I think what these lessons in history have a lot of universal value. There's definitely something you can extract from that in order to enrich our ability to appreciate and analyze and discern the very, very smoky, cloudy minefield of false narratives and lies that we have to navigate through right now. So books are there, the videos are there, and things like that.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend people dive into Matthew Erat's work. Matthew, if I can keep you for a little bit longer, I'd love to ask you some questions. We'll be
Sure.
we'll be publishing for a while. Boy, I have a long list. I wish we could just like settle in here with a lot of coffee. But but one of the questions that I just love to touch on something you explained something in a presentation that I was lucky to attend once before. And you've touched on it today, but I'd just love to clarify a little bit. The impression I walked away from, and for those of us who are not historians, it's a lot like people who aren't scientists, medical doctors, when they follow a lecture I may give on genetics and spike proteins and stuff. We people walk away with some good summary impressions, might forget some of the details, but some impressions that help them navigate their life. One of the impressions that I came away with was that you have it historically. I mean, before the Bolshevik revolution, before what I now see in my early studies as a real atrocity against the people of Russia. But before that, under the Tsars, that there was a real, very positive spirit between Russia and the newly forming United States of America. And you said in the lecture, and you touched on it today, that the decision to develop across the West, the decision to build the rail across the West by the operatives of the British Empire here in the region now called Canada, that that was done to keep the Americans and the Russians from getting together, from working together, because they had the potential to basically outperform the British Empire. Is that true? And could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the biggest danger, the biggest fear of the British Empire at the end of the 19th century, especially through the work of the allies of Lincoln in Russia, who had helped oversee the building up of the Trans-Siberian Railway. The Trans-Siberian Railway was made possible because of the work of people like Cassius Clay, the U.S. ambassador to Russia, who was helping to educate the Russians around what Lincoln was doing, what the American system was all about, as far as a new type of system that allows for a limited kind of free trade, but under the context of protective, productive credit through state banks that would be directed not towards simply being valued by what the fluctuating, vacillating whimsy of the markets would say, because that it left to itself, the markets might say that heroin is worth money or whatever, like something destructive could be worth some Bitcoin. Look at the way that thing vacillates price wise, like a roller coaster every day. It can double in price. You can't really plan long-term thinking with something that's so ephemeral, and it's been like that for a long time. That's how the tulips of the tulip bubble grew to become more valuable than whole castles in the Netherlands in the 17th century. Before that you know busted as a bubble must. But that sort of thing, which is the consequence of an obedience to the British variation of free trade capitalism, is like always going to be some form of speculative chaos that will then weaken the nation who's stupid enough to apply it, and then that nation will then be reabsorbed back under the economic clutches of that global empire that's very centralized. And so, Cassius Clay, E. Peshine Smith in Japan, you had a lot of great leaders of Lincoln, like Lincoln's friends and allies around the world, organizing to apply this American system broadly. And in Russia, the Trans-Siberian was built with locomotives and locomotives from Philadelphia, from the Baldwin Locomotive Factory of Philadelphia, that were transported over to Russia, that ran across the Russian state, the Russian Federation, and that were supposed to integrate down into the Russian Russian Chinese rail lines with the help of like-minded French thinkers who were admirers of Lincoln around Sadi Carnot, the assassinated French president of 1895, who was killed by an anarchist, the same grouping that had killed McKinley just 2 years later, and the same grouping that killed Alexander II, the same anarchists that were all organized by this weird city of London, because the anarchist headquarters of the world was the city of London. That's where London had the International Anarchist Conference of 1872. So they were organizing this global, basically terrorist network to carry out terrorism more broadly, bombings of public sectors in order to keep a state of terror and fear, kind of like what was done under the years of lead of Operation Gladio. Keep the people in a state of constant tension and have them then run to their increasingly captured governments to provide security against invisible, evil, scary forces. They did that again, and it rebranded itself, but the same technique under the war against terror, which is ongoing.
It
Um,
sounds like COVID and a
yeah,
lot
yeah,
of
yeah.
things that are happening today.
Totally, yeah. Invisible enemies that want to kill you, whether it's of the germ variety or whether it's of the terrorist variety, from radicalizing madrasas, getting money by the CIA, to fund and radicalize broken young men in Afghanistan, who are then just given a new mission in life, paid for by the CIA and MI6, of course, who are then convenient weapons, human disposable weapons, to infuse fear into dumbed down Westerners who are more than willing to give up their freedoms for security. And that was going on back with the anarchist days too. So, and then they could carry out hits. They could be used as disposable tools to carry out a higher level hit of a head of state if need be. It sometimes will trigger a major war, like what happened right before World War One. It's kind of a simple, brutal formula, but they've been doing it for a while. Anyway, yeah, the biggest fear of the empire of losing their grip was this idea, this possibility that was very likely of a Russia, German, US led trifecta, which would have also involved pro industrial France, an anti fascist pro industrial France, which was all sort of like by the 1890s, early 1900s, really moving in tandem. And that was creating a sphere protection for Canada, for the Canadian patriots to emerge and to make maneuvers that would have been impossible under normal times. And that's why Lord Milner brought in even Halford Mackinder to come to Canada, bankrolled by the Rhodes Trust in 1909 as well, to help plan out how to keep Canada under the control of the empire. So yeah, that's been always a recurring theme and a fear, and it was a recurring theme as well later on when Franklin Roosevelt came to power and revived this McKinley American system, which I've written about volume two of my Clash of the Two Americas. I go through the story in some great detail, where he again revived this strategy of a U.S., Russian, Chinese. This time that China was becoming more powerful and was being invited into this U.S. Russian alliance to break the system of fascism and empire, including the British Empire, from the world. And Churchill and Churchill's allies in America despised this idea, which is why they worked very hard to eliminate FDR under very unnatural, suspicious circumstances on April 12th of 1945, which Stalin had even said he was, for all of Stalin's problems, he at the very least was organized around FDR's vision of a world liberated from the system of the British Empire, and he didn't trust the official narrative and sent his people to investigate and told FDR's son, who became a journalist, that it's Churchill's people who likely killed your father through poisoning. And as soon as FDR was dead, the dream was dead. The empire reconstituted itself. FDR's enemies took power just like they did after Lincoln died, and Lincoln's enemies took power, gave rights back to the former Confederates, slave masters, to have full economic power by the 1870s, 1880s, really. And JFK had a similar idea when he offered the Russians, in 1963. He went to the UN and he made this beautiful speech. People can watch it online. I cited in my recent documentary. People can watch this beautiful thing where JFK is like, look, let's stop with this mutual assured destruction thing. It's going to get everybody killed. And let's redirect our scientific efforts towards preserving humanity by having a joint science program of investigating the universe together, with the Russians and the Americans working together to go into space and to share and develop nuclear science together, instead of just using it to build bombs to kill each other. And it's a great speech. And according to Khrushchev, who I don't like Khrushchev, but his son gave an interview in 1997 saying that his father was very excited and wanted to accept JFK's offer, except for the fact that 3 weeks later, JFK was dead. So, we see how this game is played. And even though, and that's why it's like, even though the Bolsheviks were largely fueled by the same bankers who were funding this Federal Reserve takeover of American banking, and were funding the growth of fascism, Italian, French, German alike, and American and Canadian. We had a whole wide array of Canadian fascist movements, which is a whole class unto itself, that was receiving vast support by these same groupings. They're funding the controlled left, the controlled right, and everything, in between. Despite that, there were still patriots who knew better and were able to then, the way that Wilfrid Laurier was able to work with institutions that were dishonest through Confederation, he was able to still work with and redirect the dishonest forces towards outcomes that were beneficial, against the will of those who were more devoted to the Johnny Macdonald British Empire way of keeping control. He was able to do his thing. And the same thing we saw, just as there were patriots in Quebec that were able to then work with Laurier to infiltrate the systems of this unnatural confederation and make it work for the benefit of Canadians and the prosperity of the future, so too did we find that even within the Bolshevik Russia, there were legitimate patriots and nationalists who had a better understanding of the forces of global espionage, of world history, and were able to organize the minds of certain people effectively around Stalin by the 1920s to realize how he was being played and used as a weapon. And there you had a very interesting battle where the more insidious Wall Street, London nexus of these operatives around Trotsky were isolated and were effectively finally removed, exiled from Russia, at which point Stalin became labeled as more and more of a threat that was harder and harder for the city of London and Wall Street bankers to control. And he became more allied to the idea of what FDR was bringing to the table. And he gave a famous speech where he said, look, there's two kinds of capitalists. There's the feudal capitalists, we can't work with them. And then you have the industrial capitalists, we can work with them. Trotsky basically was of the view that, no, we have to just overthrow the entire system of the social order and create a system of technocratic Soviet control over the world. And he built up an entire deep state structure. He was the guy who was in Wall Street, getting the money from the Wall Street bankers. He got arrested also, trying to make his way back to Russia in Canada. And it was the British High Command that actually intervened to force the Canadians to release him from jail, fulfill his task, which was to basically carry out and oversee the Bolshevik Revolution. He was supposed to be the new Bolshevik czar, who was going to be a well-behaved local tyrant. And there was a big battle that most Westerners have no idea. It's been a big surprise for me just to research this whole part of world history, where the Trotsky networks were officially finally taken down, although some of them did remain underground inside of Russia. And they were the ones who were working to create the Russian Fascist Party, to create the alliance with Hitler and the fascists, as well as the fascists in England, to align with Hitler. That was a big part of the Moscow trials as well. Much of the information that I've learned about has been written by this amazing historian. This guy's done some really great work called Grover Furr, who's gone through the original archival classified archives, both of Russia, but also of Harvard and other places. Despite them having been purged by forces that were loyal to Trotsky, there's still enough there to get a real picture of what those trials were all about, and the fascist network that was loyal to Wall Street inside of Russia. And point being is that Stalin and FDR had a common view of a world liberated from the British Empire through big projects, and the Bering Strait Tunnel project was actually discussed by FDR and his ally Henry Wallace, the vice president from 41 to 45 under FDR, and he wrote about it in a pamphlet I cite extensively called I forgot the name of the pamphlet, but he wrote about this discussion for building the Bering Strait Tunnel of rail, highways, and air connections between Russia and the United States, which I think, Mackenzie King was also a big fan of, and C.D. Howe was a big fan of. So we had this momentum that JFK also tried to tap into and revive that keeps on getting subverted. And the fact that it's getting subverted by these killers, this death cult, means in my mind that it represents a real fear, a weakness in the system of this ancient hereditary oligarchy as a way of thinking and a way of strategizing that I could see today express itself in a number of ways through the Polar Silk Road, the Russia-China offers to the West to work together on building a system of win-win cooperation on both Arctic, but also other parts of the world on the BRI, and why certain forces I understand want to destroy that at all costs, even if it means, lighting the Middle East on fire through these unilateral bombings of Iran and other places that could easily spread out into nuclear war that could completely destroy this potential for many, 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 many more generations. Unfortunately, if we're stupid enough to let this happen.
I wonder, Matthew, if I can ask you a question about what I perceive as one of the big challenges we face as a species. And again, take it with a grain of salt because I'm commenting on history and my education is almost entirely science and medicine. The last few years has made me very enthusiastic to try and figure things out, which is this matter of who prints the money. It seems that since at least the early 1900s, that unbeknownst to most of us, I mean, most people think of the Federal Reserve. That's part of the federal government. And of course, a government has a right to issue money. Of course, that causes inflation, but it's the people's government, so the people are allowed to issue money. But then, what we've learned is that actually there's a private entity called the Federal Reserve that, if I understand it correctly, whenever it is decided that the US needs more money in circulation, they don't make money, they borrow it. The feds buy bonds with interest. And so every time an American dollar is issued, whether it's just on computer or a physical, it's actually they've borrowed that money from the Federal Reserve with interest, which is a heck of a stacked game. I mean, if we were playing Monopoly and I get to own the bank and be one of the players, I am clearly going to win the game and do whatever I want to everybody. That seems to be the situation we're in, and I don't know what that situation looks like everywhere. I don't exactly understand, the Bank of Canada situation. But is that an accurate assessment? And can you comment on, if so, or with subtle nuances, how does that affect our situation and what challenges does that present to us who are, we now understand, involved in this ongoing century after century effort to liberate ourselves from this hereditary oligarch parasite class?
Great question. And as you could guess from the way I approach a lot of these sorts of questions, it's not going to be a simple, straight cut answer. However, I'll do my best to share what I think about this. So in Canada, we have, like, as you mentioned, a Bank of Canada that was originally set up as a private entity modeled on the British City of London Bank of England. which is again was originally I think it's nominally nationalized, but not really because it's still a crown corporation, as is the Bank of Canada. But it had originally like a shareholder system, much more profit oriented system under its board of directors. And one of the most toxic aspects of this formula of the private central banking model is the idea that number one, you have an agency above the nation. So this private agency, very shadowy, run by specialists of finance outside of the authority of the sovereign nation state itself, because, they can't be contaminated by the whimsy of elected, ephemeral governments that come and go. We need to have more competent specialists, man, who know the mathematical calculus and the intricacies, who can read the tea leaves better, the modern oracles, as they called Alan Greenspan, the Federal Reserve Chair from JP Morgan. He was called the Oracle. Why did they call him that? It wasn't a cute name. It was because they consciously created such a degree of mathematical complexity, and they've been doing this for a long time, around the individual human's mind and the actual economy that we live in. There's so many degrees of mathematical garbage that they placed as filters through which we have to move our minds before we're qualified to cast opinion about economic matters, that you have to almost be like a high priest if you can, master the probabilistic calculus of the all of these things that they do, to understand the Black-Scholes formula that won a Nobel Prize. But it's like this, you could fill blackboards full of this thing that somehow helps us, manage derivatives. Like, it's, so they think of them as they think of these people as oracles. They're the few specialists who can read the tea leaves. And that's the same thing. That's exactly what John Maynard Keynes himself, also a leading central banker, a proponent of a world run by central banks under the Bank of International Settlements and the Bank of England of the 1930s and 40s, and a eugenicist and a pedophile who hated FDR, even though we have been told that FDR was a Keynesian. Fact is, and I prove that in my book, both men despised each other and thought each other incompetent. FDR was not a Keynesian. He was a follower of Lincoln. Different thing. And that's a lie we've been told by those who would wish to keep us ignorant of this history that I've been trying to, raise. The Federal Reserve, when it was created in 1913, had a shadowy board of directors that included European bankers, but also JP Morgan, as has been revealed over the years. Leading JP Morgan bankers were also part of this thing. It was set up in the wake of a meeting on Jekyll Island in 1910. Senator Aldrich, who is a father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller, was also a leading member of this thing as part of the Aldrich plan. Part of it was sold to the American people originally as part of a narrative that said, hey, let's bring back nationalism. Let's bring back a national policy of that we last saw with Lincoln, of in Lincoln's greenbacks. And they were using a language that attracted patriots, because that's how Lincoln was able to successfully keep the nation together. It was partially Russia coming in to save America, which they did through, Alexander II sending the Russian Navy ships to New York and California. But also Lincoln was able to redeploy the system of national banking and greenbacks that were tied to productive economic growth. And the idea under that system was you have treasury bills. It wasn't a private entity. You have the treasury issues certain notes that are then the basis upon which a credit is emitted to various banks that have kept, you have these like national banks or banks with national charters that put part of their capital inside of the treasury, and that can then emit credit for projects like the Transcontinental Railway that Lincoln unleashed in 1863, and other things that then provide loans to farmers and to manufacturers and people who have a good idea but want to test it out. They need a loan. So you do that on reasonable interest grounds. And the basis upon which money circulates, around which the markets are organized, is premised on the idea of building a nation, increasing abundance and bounty, increasing healthy competition. That's what Lincoln did. That's how they were saying we have to create this new thing called the Federal Reserve. It's too chaotic before the federal. And so people bought the idea, and it did emulate on the surface some of the appearance of what Lincoln was doing and what earlier on Hamilton had done with the First and Second National Bank on the surface. The difference being, though, that the Lincoln Hamiltonian national banking system of the American system was premised on the idea that number one, the bank must always be subservient to the nation and its laws, that the directorship of the bank must always be within the nation itself, not external to it. Number three, that the credit the bank emits, because I mean, currency like Lincoln had done with the greenbacks is not intrinsically a bad thing. If like, because you could have good debt or bad debt. I could imagine me or you getting into a good debt if we like, if I'm a farmer, let's say you've got skills as a doctor, you just lack some equipment, some tools, maybe a building to work out of, some staff to work with. And you're like, well, I can make this work. And you take out a loan, reasonable interest, you build up your business, and over time it's self-liquidating because you create through your work in the physical reality with these tools, you create more abundance, and now you're anti-entropic. That's a self-extinguishing debt. It's a good debt because it was designed to be self-extinguishing. Same thing for a farmer, with no plow, no tractor, take a debt, get the plow, get the tractor. A couple of years later, you're free of your debt. You paid it off. Okay, good. Bad debt is, I want to buy my drugs, but I don't have money. Or let's say, I could quadruple my cash by going to the casino. Can I get a loan? 30% interest? Okay, sure. Yeah, I'm good for it. And that's the kind of like predatory debt and predatory lending that the Federal Reserve and the British Empire was always very good at. So the Fed emulated some of the aspects of the proper national banking system, but they were always designed to create this mathematical system of governance by a technocratic elite that would be outside of the authority of the nation's laws. And because of that, would be able to indebt and get the nation itself enmeshed within the system of control that they themselves managed of debt without building anything real. So they consciously didn't build up the real economy, which is much more easy to think about. Like, from the standpoint of just medicine and health, right? The human body has a lot of similarities to the human social organism as well, of multiple generations living in a society. There's certain common threads, right, that we could see. If you increase your as the body of people grows, you've got more people living a higher quality of life. You need to increase the food production. You got to increase the quality of the food. You got to increase the transport corridors. You got to increase the energy as you have more people. You got to have more heat, more energy to support like the metabolism, the metabolic power of having 5 million people versus 100,000 people. You have to have a system of energy that can support and help that type of populated body thrive. So you want to go for get off of coal. You want to get onto better quality things like natural gas and oil. You want to be able to eventually get off that to something even better quality like nuclear, the atom. And then you want to move towards something even higher quality as far as like atomic fission to fusion. You always want to think about burning better quality of metabolism to support the body that allows for people to live longer, better quality of lives, all these things. And so whatever your currency in circulation is, whether it's digital currency, whether it's plastic straws or seashells or whatever, gold. You can't eat gold. You're starving. Your food production breaks down. If you got gold, you still can't eat it. But it's better than fiat cash in a way. Although fiat cash you can at least use to like wipe your butt. When money loses all value in hyperinflation, you can't do that with gold. So all that to say, the thing that infuses value into whatever we agree upon as currency has got to be tied to the physical reality of the thing we live in, which the Federal Reserve was designed to cut us off of. And we only have like really one example under Franklin Roosevelt when the Fed was put on a bit of a leash and started being forced to abide by natural like national law. When FDR's industrialist friend Mariner Eccles was installed by FDR as the chairman of the Fed, and he started forcing it to provide credit for the first time to the real economy. Although the JP Morgan enemies of FDR still worked to use the Fed to sabotage the New Deal at different times too. But that was the only time I could see where the Fed has ever been used kind of okay, even though FDR had to get around it by creating his own national bank through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is a whole thing unto itself that I wrote about in my book. But yeah, you got to people just have to have, whether it's a system of state banks like a Bank of BC or a Bank of Quebec or a credit union. it doesn't really matter. If people are stupid enough to not have a clue of what real value is and real debt versus bad debt is, then it'll always, these things will always be used to enslave us, even on the localized level. You could have local banks, thousands of local banks that might appear to be more free, but if people are still too culturally dumbed down to know what is needed to, you know, make sure their kids thrive, these things will still be used to enslave them. So it's always that question of like, do we have an understanding of the science of the health of the social body early, which a freaking 7-year-old kid can learn the foundations of real economic science and cast opinion by the time they're 8, 9 years old about like what is a smart and a stupid thing to do economically, and not have to be a PhD, oracle high priest who cast opinions about economic policy, which is our insane world today.
But it is really quite bizarre, Matthew. And you think about how in this day and age, I mean, the highest money earners and often people regarded as you say, the oracles of society are it's about the business that should be very simple, the counting and exchanging of shells, but it's become about the, fractional reserve lending of shells, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these financial formulas, like you said, they're so complicated. And yet, I mean, I can think about things that great people have contributed to society, science, technology, plumbing, farming, growing food, building houses, making bridges. I mean, there's an awful lot of things where at the end of the day, the person didn't just make money, but they contributed something real and useful and positive to society. And yet we have this banking class who would appear contribute nothing to society. They don't even clean a toilet or cook somebody breakfast. And yet they seem to be somewhat ruling the world, no matter what game is played, no matter who's steered through the divide and conquer and these embedded false leaders into fighting and killing each other. And these guys just keep accumulating power and assets in the background running the puppet show. Is that a paranoid perception, or is that a fairly accurate statement?
No, yeah, it's straight. That's straight up truth. You've got
Wow.
it's a class. It's a caste, self-professed set of families that have been hypnotizing themselves over many generations to believe that there is something divine and superior in their blood that ordains them the right to manipulate the human herd on behalf of their own perceived self-interests. And members who come and go, over generations of that particular caste are trained and groomed in a certain sick, toxic culture. One should not envy those princes born into the castles and hereditary estates and crusts and fondies they're beholden to, as Disney has trained us to want to, you know, admire the princes and princesses. It's just like in every Disney movie since over the last 75 years.
True.
We shouldn't. We should feel pity. If anything, if you want to feel an emotion, feel pity on what these people have to go through and get in their elite boarding schools, the sets of experiences that are set up for them to be broken of certain human faculties and to be initiated into this unnatural hereditary system that they were themselves born into and expected to be managers of. It's an unfortunate thing. And I do see it now increasingly more and more cultural, as a cultural fight, more than I used to. Like I used to think of it more as like, here are the bad guys, give me the names of the families. And yeah, you could do that. People have done the exercise, and they've mapped out some of the dominant old families that many of those names we don't typically know. Like there's a few names we're given for the conspirophiles out there to be satisfied. The Rothschilds, the Rockefellers. They're the Warburgs and the Sassoons. Like there are these names given to satisfy narratives for those who want something that encapsulates a better description of the reality of how history has unfolded than the typical shit we're given in our school books. It's not even it. Like there's higher rungs above that take us into the old black nobility that can go back to the days of the early Roman Empire, even the Roman Republic, probably to a certain degree, even towards other empires like Babylon, which are, they're still there. And I used to be more obsessed with like, give me the names. If we just know who they are and where they live, we can do something. No, I'm not like that anymore. At this point, it's more because the problem is really this invisible field of the culture that both shapes them and also shapes the culture of the slave class as well that we've been born into. There's certain musical, aesthetic, scientific notions that have been coloring this invisible field. Like, what is the culture, right? It's this culture that forms the identities, the values of who we are, but that we could feasibly, if we qualify ourselves, also in turn influence for the good or for the bad, and so the culture is really where it's at. That's where I think Benjamin Franklin, that's what made him such an effective human being, is he early on recognized that way of thinking. He tuned his mind to that realm very early on and used his time around creating cultural. I mentioned, the Canada Post and the printing of Chinese literature in America, the Analects and other things to broaden the perspective of the identities of people who had to become citizens who are currently still subjects. He's like, no, to change somebody from a subject to a citizen is not an easy task. It's a natural thing to do, but it takes work. And people don't want to do work as our I mean, maybe babies do. Babies want to like learn how to. That's actually interesting, right? Babies like are early on, first couple of years, they're actually doing a lot of work trying to figure out how do they use language, how do they walk, how do they do these difficult things. They have that hunger, and it dissipates too easily. You've got a bad culture of peasants or that encourages peasantry. But sort of respark that childlike wonder and awe and excitement and faith that we can like lean into the unknown and learn new skills. So that's a citizen's culture, and that's what Benjamin Franklin worked hard to build that up, and the excitement around like having fun with science. If you read his writings on electricity, he's coming up with all sorts of ways of getting people to hypothesize what is this mysterious invisible fluid that when we hold hands in a circle and somebody touches a charged glass orb that you could charge with like a feather or a piece of amber, and have the last person in that holding the circle can get like a shock, and nobody in between. So it really enriches your ability to be sensitive to the invisible laws of the universe that has application on how we think about philosophy of life and morality as well. And how ultimately he was not part of an elite class. He was not part of an elite family, but he was able to trump with creativity and devotion to truth what every other, Sorbonne, Oxford trained academic was incapable of doing across Europe. And that made him a phenomenon. He was known as the Prometheus of America. And through that, he was able to then organize and gain respect even amongst the elites who didn't think like him, but they couldn't deny the fact that he did what he did and that they admire what he did and want to use the fruits of what he did through the technologies that were opened up to them. And he was able to like work to build up enough allies and admirers amongst the courts of France and of Germany and of Russia. He became the first American member of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and he made its president, Ekaterina Deshkova, interestingly enough, a female president of the Russian Academy of Sciences and a major reformer who he made her the first Russian member of his Philadelphia philosophical societies. Big, amazing part of history, right? Like fun idea. But she was also key in making the League of Armed Neutrality happen that ensured that the Americans had the support because of Russia, Spain, a few other places to get the equipment, the fuel, the weapons it needed from European allies to help the rebels fight the empire. Again, Ben Franklin. So you got this quality, right, of mind, of identity that I think we should just try to study. And that's why I always invoke the personalities of like let's take, people need to take some time to just listen to Martin Luther King's speeches and think about the quality of found wisdom contained within these poetic moral lessons he weaves into every one of his sermons and speeches. It's there's so much that's transformative that gives us insights into the reality that we're living in. And same thing for JFK's speeches and Lincoln, read his speeches. I've got his. So I don't have an easy answer, but it's something there. It's this ancient evil is unnatural. It's been holding on like a parasite. I think our destiny is ultimately to overcome it. I don't know if we've achieved that level of maturity yet to be able to heal ourselves from it because we've tolerated a lot of stupidity for many decades now. We're in a bad place. We might fall into a much worse place as a dark age, maybe, hoping not. But I do think our ultimate destiny is to shake it off and to heal. We'll see.
Well, I love to hear that optimism, especially from somebody who's so well studied. And actually, I heard you in another interview recently where you said, well, all isn't lost. I mean, we can navigate our way out of it. But you said, but historically, very few people have, so we shouldn't take it as a given or an easy one. I like what you said earlier in this interview too. You said history doesn't repeat itself. History is repeated by fools. So we don't want to be the fools repeating history, which is why I reached out to you, Matthew. And so enjoyed this conversation. My head is full of, new heroes that I want to look deeper into, from Benjamin Franklin to Wilfrid Laurier to Martin Luther King. I want to listen to more speeches of JFK, and I want to follow more of your work. Folks, highly recommend Matthew Ehret's work. We're going to put lots of links. For those people just catching this on video and not catching the published material, in the published material, drtrozzi.news, Dr. Trozzi on Substack, you're going to find quite a library generated from these opportunities to speak with Matthew Hurd, who, please tell us you will come back and I can talk to you more. I have a million questions. I could keep you here all day and just gradually transition from coffee to beer. But I don't think we'll be able to do that. And yeah, it's been very, very inspirational. Matthew, just for folks, where is the best place? As I say, if someone's just catching this on video and they want to tap into your world, your books, your online programs, your lectures, your videos, where's the best place to start?
I guess. And yeah, for sure. Anytime you say the word, I'm happy to join and chat with you and just have an opportunity to share the stuff that's just been bubbling in my head for so long. I appreciate any of these opportunities that you can give. And yeah, as far as if people want to dig in a little bit more deeply, the books are probably the easiest place to find the books. And some of the books that we've published, my wife also has published a couple of excellent books going through some of this suppressed history. And they're all very easy to find on canadianpatriot.org, either in paperback or in PDF or Kindle versions. We do have some copies in our garage. If people want signed copies, they can send me a message through that website, canadianpatriot.org, and just see which books you like. The Untold History of Canada books that we have here, these are that's a 4 volume set. And like I said, they're all very easy to find on Amazon, or like I said, contact me. The videos that we've made, we have a little production studio which we built up over the past 4 years, and we've made about 18 documentaries, and that's growing. That's a fun exercise too, and that's also you'll find on a video section of Watch the Films. Most of them are for free. We have a more educational website, cultural educational website for people who want to bite onto something that's a bit more of that thick substance, called risingtidefoundation.net. We launched that in 2019. You'll find a lot of good material there. Some Rising Tide cultural videos are available there too. And finally, I would say Substack is the last place. I try to put out things every day. Most for free. Some things are paid, but most are for free. And that's mattheweret.substack.com.
Oh, thank you much. Matthew, you've made my day by telling me you'd be glad to come back. I've got so many questions. We could go for hours, but I guess we'll have to break it down. And our next interview will probably need to be like in one of General Flynn's bunkers so we can have some of these conversations without being taken out. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time, friends. Thanks for taking your time to dive into this material. Thanks for learning more about Canadian history and world history, because I think that it's so important to get leadership on these subjects from people like Matthew, just like we get leadership from people like Tess Laurie and Peter McCullough on science and technology. We need leadership on our history to know what's really happened, where we are, and get insights for where we're going to go. And it sounds like let's go for being enlightened, well read, not emotionally responsive to all the cues and pokes we get from the fake media to emotionally charge us to go and kill each other while they're laughing their heads off above the table.
I would turn that into a t-shirt. That would
All
be
right. Well,
let's do it.
excellent. Thank you so much. God bless you, Matthew Ehret, folks.